In a lot of my videos, people like to ask me what IDE I'm using. I usually prefer to go on the lighter end, something that has less than more. As long as it has a good syntax highlighter, I usually don't care too much. However, Visual Studio Code has become this incredible platform that I'm more than happy to use daily for all of my programming needs. I even do iPhone and Android development using Visual Studio Code. If you wish to use the exact same IDE I will be using in this video, and most likely my other videos as well moving forward, Visual Studio Code is a fantastic IDE, and I do recommend that you use it. Let's go ahead and get into the basics of using Node. I've opened up a workspace in Visual Studio Code that will allow me to keep my files organized. On Windows, you can access this by pressing Control-K and then Control-O. That will open up a directory. Select an empty directory or wherever you want to have your working files, and feel free to code along with me. The files for these lessons will be available on Git, and a link will be available in the description. Now that we have Node installed, before we go and jump in and code a bunch of JavaScript, let's look at Node itself and see what we can do. I've opened up my terminal here. What's really interesting is, much like other languages like Python, where I can do things like this, I can do something similar in Node. This allows us to use the code directly, but it's highly not recommended since each one is a single command. But it's a good way of making sure that you have the right versions and that everything is installed. As you can see, I've installed version 12, though everything in these tutorials should be fully functional in a version 10 or a long-term support branch. So let's get started with some basics. JavaScript looks very much like a C-based language. It's not as freeform as something like Python, but it has a good structure that's quite readable as long as you don't have to get into callback hell. I'll get into that more in a later video. Something that's also very interesting about JavaScript is that it's what's known as an asynchronous language. It has this thing called the event loop, and it's kind of complicated. I'm sure you can find resources online that would explain it far better than I would be able to. But basically what the event loop is every time you ask JavaScript to do something, it adds an entry to the event loop and then processes the next event. So over time, you can fill up the event loop and it will process things in a first come, first served basis. There's ways to get around that, of course, but this commonly causes issues with things like remote requests. Where in a language like Python or Ruby, we could simply say, go get this remote file and then read the file, output it to your console. In JavaScript, that code path would actually fail because we're still trying to get the data from the remote call before we even get to do the next two commands. So we have to do something called a callback. Now, modern versions of JavaScript have addressed this with something called promises, which makes the code much more readable and far more performant. But once again, I'll get into things like promises in later videos. Right now, let's just look at the basic gist of JavaScript. Now, before I actually run this code or start to write some code in this file, one of the things I'm going to need to do is initialize a Node project. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up our terminal again. It has the files. So what we need to do is we need to do npm init. This is asking us our package name. We'll just call this tutorials. We'll leave it at version 1. No description. Index.js is definitely our preferred entry point. Our test command can be empty. Our Git repository can also be empty for now. There we go. This is fine. You'll see that it creates this package.json file, and we can modify this. We can also create it ourselves. So that generator is just kind of a convenience method. What this package.js file allows us to do is specify dependencies for our project. It also lets us run commands like npm start instead of having to manually initialize Node, the script, and all of its dependencies. So what we're going to do now is we're going to start writing some code. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to say console.log hello world. While JavaScript doesn't require you using a closing semicolon on your statements, it is significantly faster for the interpreter to have those semicolon statements in there. So I'd highly recommend that you use them. It also makes your code significantly cleaner than it would be without them. So what we're going to do is we're going to save this file, and then we're going to say npm start. Now you'll notice that it says that the script start is missing. All we have to do is come over here to where it says scripts. We're going to add another entry. Now, if you don't quite understand what JSON is, I'll have a separate video on what JSON is and how you can use it. But for now, what we're going to do is we're just going to say node index.js. Don't forget our comma. We can get rid of that. Boom. So as you can see, it outputted hello world. What console.log does is simply prints to the console of Node. There's more complex, higher level ones that are similar to print commands and not simply log commands, but they're not terribly useful in most cases, and you don't really need to use them. Console.log usually fulfills that need quite nicely. Now that we've done our obligatory hello world program, join me on the next video where we'll start diving into it a little bit deeper